The Siberian taiga stretched endlessly, an expanse of pine, birch, and spruce trees that blanketed the land like an ancient fortress. For miles, there was nothing but wilderness, silent and undisturbed, except for the occasional rustle of wildlife or the distant cry of a bird. It was a place where nature reigned supreme, where the thin line between man and the wild blurred into a misty haze. For Mikhail, the taiga had always held a certain allure. It was a place where he could escape the clamor of Moscow, the noise, the crowds, the monotony. He had grown up listening to stories about the taiga's mystery and power, tales of hunters disappearing, of shamans whispering ancient spells, and of shadowy figures who watched from the depths of the forest. Most people in the city dismissed these as old wives' tales, but for Mikhail, they were part of the forest's charm. He had been planning this solo expedition for months, meticulously gathering gear. A sturdy tent, a reliable rifle, a hunting knife, and provisions that would last him weeks if necessary. He pored over maps, searching for the most remote area he could reach, where no roads cut through the forest and no people ventured. Mikhail wanted to disappear, if only for a little while, and find something genuine and untouched by civilization. It was late September when he finally set out. The trees had begun their transformation, their leaves turning shades of amber and crimson. The air was crisp and fresh, a welcome change from the city's smog. Mikhail drove as far as his old SUV would take him down the dirt tracks that wound through the outskirts of the forest. Eventually, the roads became impassable, overgrown with shrubs and blocked by fallen trees. He parked the vehicle, shouldered his heavy backpack, and set off on foot. The hike took hours, and the deeper he went, the more the silence enveloped him. The forest seemed alive, with birds fluttering from tree to tree and small animals rustling through the underbrush. Mikhail's spirits were high. This was the wilderness he had dreamed of, a place where he could be completely alone, where he could experience the raw beauty of nature. By late afternoon, he found a small clearing by a river. The ground was soft, covered in a carpet of moss, and the river water ran clear and cold. It was a perfect spot for a campsite. He set up his tent, stacked firewood, and prepared for his first night in the taiga. The sky above darkened, stars emerging one by one as the sun dipped below the horizon. A crescent moon cast a pale light through the branches, casting long, skeletal shadows. Mikhail built a fire, the flames crackling as they reached upward. He sat by it, sipping tea from a tin mug, enjoying the solitude. The wind stirred the treetops, and the distant howl of a wolf echoed across the forest. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. As the fire flickered, he felt the shadows around him shift, as if watching. Shrugging off the sensation, Mikhail reminded himself that this was what he had come for: silence, solitude, and the untamed wild. He listened to the river, its steady flow soothing him, and eventually retired to his tent, zipping it shut against the chill. Hours later, he woke suddenly. Something had broken the silence. Mikhail lay still, ears straining to catch any sound beyond the soft rustle of leaves and the faint murmur of the river. The wind had died down, leaving an eerie stillness that pressed in on him. And then he heard it, faint and distant, like the whisper of a breeze, but with words hidden within. At first, he thought it was just his imagination, but then it came again, soft, low, and insistent. A whisper, just on the edge of hearing. He couldn't make out the words, but it felt as if they were directed at him. Mikhail's grip tightened on his flashlight, and he slowly unzipped the tent, the chill night air biting his skin. He shone the beam of light into the darkness. The fire had died down to embers, casting weak, flickering shadows. Beyond its light, the forest was an impenetrable black. He scanned the area, his breath clouding in the cold air, but saw nothing, just the dark outlines of trees and the faint glimmer of the river's surface. Probably just the wind, he muttered, trying to reassure himself. But even as he said it, he knew it didn't sound right. The whisper had a human quality to it, like someone speaking in a language just beyond his understanding. He lay back down, but sleep didn't come easily. The whispering continued, distant and indistinct, and each time he closed his eyes, he felt a growing sense of unease. as if the forest itself was awake, watching. When dawn broke, Mikhail emerged from his tent, relieved to see the sunlight filtering through the trees. The forest seemed almost friendly in the morning light. He made himself a quick breakfast, but the memory of the whispers lingered. Determined not to let it affect him, he set off to explore the surrounding area. He followed the river upstream, watching as it wound through the dense forest. The air was crisp, and the sunlight warmed his face, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. At first, it was just a prickling sensation on the back of his neck, but soon he noticed other signs: disturbed patches of earth, branches snapped at odd angles, and most unsettling of all, footprints. The footprints were unlike anything he had ever seen. They were long and narrow, almost human but not quite. The toes were elongated, the shape stretched. He crouched down to examine them more closely. They were fresh, pressed deep into the soft earth, and seemed to move in a pattern, circling the area before disappearing into the forest. Mikhail stood up, his heart beating faster. He felt exposed, vulnerable. He scanned the trees, but the forest remained still, its vast silence pressing in on him. Taking a deep breath, he decided to head back to camp, his pace quickening with every step. Back at the clearing, the atmosphere felt different. The air was colder, and the sky had turned gray, heavy with clouds. The sense of isolation was overwhelming. Mikhail busied himself with fortifying the campsite, gathering more firewood and checking his rifle. As evening approached, the wind picked up, whistling through the trees with an eerie, mournful tone. The night fell quickly, and as the darkness deepened, the whispers returned. This time, they were louder, closer. He sat by the fire, his rifle across his lap, staring into the blackness. The whispers circled him, moving through the trees, just beyond the firelight. They seemed to come from all directions, overlapping, blending into a cacophony of voices. Some were soft and pleading. Others laughed, low and guttural. "Mikhail," one voice whispered, drawing out his name in a sing-song tone. He jumped to his feet, shining his flashlight into the darkness. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice echoing through the trees. The only response was laughter, deep and mocking. Shadows moved between the trees, slipping just out of sight. Mikhail's hands shook as he scanned the forest, but the figures stayed in the periphery, never fully revealing themselves. Panicking, he retreated to his tent, zipping it shut. The voices grew louder, pressing against the fabric of the tent. The wind howled, rattling the poles, and the air grew so cold that frost began to form on the inside. He gripped his rifle, pointing it at the entrance, waiting for something, anything, to appear. Hours passed, the whispers eventually fading, but sleep was impossible. He lay awake, his senses on high alert, until the first light of dawn crept into the tent. When he emerged, his campsite was in disarray. His belongings had been scattered across the clearing, his backpack overturned, and strange footprints circled the tent, dozens of them, overlapping. They were the same elongated prints he had seen by the river, but now they were everywhere, as if something had surrounded him during the night. Mikhail's breath quickened. He needed to leave. He packed his gear hastily, shoving supplies into his backpack. The forest felt different, hostile, unwelcoming. He decided to follow the river downstream, certain it would lead him back to the road. But after hours of walking, he found himself back at his own campsite. It was as if the taiga was playing a cruel game, leading him in circles. Exhausted and on the brink of panic, he checked his compass. The needle spun erratically, refusing to settle. He cursed, throwing it aside. It was useless out here, and he felt the first pangs of real fear. The taiga had him, and it wasn't going to let go. As the sky darkened once more, he built a larger fire, using almost all the wood he had gathered. The shadows around him grew longer, and the whispering started even before the sun had fully set. This time, it wasn't just whispers. He saw them, figures moving between the trees. They were tall, impossibly thin, with faces that seemed blurred, as if hidden behind a veil of mist. Their eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the firelight. Mikhail raised his rifle, heart pounding. The figures moved slowly, circling the fire, always just beyond its reach. One stepped forward, its face an incomprehensible blur. It called his name, mimicking his own voice. "Mikhail, stay with us." He fired, the shot echoing through the forest. The figure vanished, reappearing behind another tree. The others laughed, their voices blending into a grotesque chorus. Desperation clawed at him, and he fired again and again. But the shadows danced between the trees, unharmed. Realizing he couldn't fight them, he fled into the darkness, running blindly through the forest. The trees closed in, branches clawing at his clothes, and the ground seemed to shift beneath his feet. He stumbled and fell, scrambling to get up as the figures loomed closer, their laughter filling his ears. His flashlight flickered, casting brief, erratic beams of light. He saw their faces, stretched and distorted, with smiles too wide and teeth too sharp. Their eyes were black, voids that sucked in the light. He screamed, swinging his flashlight like a weapon, but the beam died, leaving him in total darkness. The cold hands reached out, grasping him, pulling him down into the shadows. The next morning, a search party found his campsite abandoned. His tent was torn open, and his gear was scattered across the clearing. The strange footprints covered the ground, leading away into the depths of the forest. The search party combed the area for days, but Mikhail was gone. All they found were whispers that echoed through the trees, and sometimes, if they listened closely, faint, mocking laughter. Mikhail had become another ghost of the taiga, one more soul lost to the forest's endless depths.